Good
Hey
morning,
there.
Stephen. Hey there. How are you
Good morning.
today?
Good afternoon. Good evening to our friends from around the world who are joining us today.
Mhm.
How have you
I'm
been?
looking forward. I've been good. I'm excited for today because you gave our audience some homework, and there were some interesting tweets in their sphere. Some people got very serious about it, and I'm looking forward to seeing, the homework people have done.
Excellent. So, and how does my audio sound?
Oh, does mine sound good?
Yours does not sound good. It sounds.
Oh, that's terrible.
So
All right,
that's
let me
okay.
turn
What we'll do
it
is
up.
get going. You can see what you can fix, but we won't let people wait for that. So, hey, everybody. So this week, what I did was a little bit different. I guess maybe I got lazy. Anyway, I was looking at some code that needed some work. And I did some work on it. I thought, oh, this would be an interesting thing to throw out to you to see if you had ideas or what would essentially catch your eye about the code and what you would change. I made no real efforts to make it a comprehensive, clear set of specifications, kind of like what you probably run into on a day-to-day basis. Here's some code. What a mess. Can you tell me more about it? No, they left. Or, hey, users, I've got some questions about these requirements. We don't really know, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully you didn't mind the ambiguity. So what I want to do is show you that original code. I'm also going to show you a blog post from Sam, who is a great UTPL SQL user and developer. And then we'll kind of sweep through the code. Then I'm going to show you a tweet that I tweeted a couple of days ago that got some interesting conversation. All right. So why don't you go ahead and share my screen?
And I'm going to do a quick sound check. Do you okay right now?
You sound better.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
Great. So this is my blog post, which I'll clean up. I'll republish when we're done with this. But anyway, I published this code, and the code is interesting. So there's the code. Again, I'm going to go into SQL Developer to actually explore in more detail.
I think you're sharing Twitter right now. Is that what you mean to be sharing?
Twitter?
I think so.
Wow, the sharing is really weird. It's not switching tabs. Okay, so I'm going to stop the screen share. Let's try that again. Share the screen. I'm sharing the whole screen too. Now we should see an infinite number of, go ahead and share that.
All right, here we go. We should know better by this stage.
Wait, why aren't we getting the infinite? Okay.
We are getting
here. Now you see Twitter. Hello?
Well, it's looking very frozen at the moment.
Wow. Okay. Let's so now what I'm going to do is share. Let's just cut to the chase. Share my screen. I'm going to share a specific application. Let's see how that works. Can you see my code?
Yes, that's better. Sorry about that. All right, we see your.
Okay, so we'll revisit the other stuff later. So, because the main thing, of course, for anybody attending one of my little talks is the code. Okay, right. So here was the starting point of the code. And basically the requirement is that they need to generate different files, different log files. And there are these different abbreviations to indicate the log file names. And there are different data sources that will be generating the rows that go into the log files. And most of the logs have the same structure, but some of them are different. So the person put together, because there were 7 different files, basically put together this pattern of 7 different file names, 7 different nested tables of the lines, the count of the lines that are in the file, et cetera, et cetera. Really not sure why they did that. Probably don't care about that. Okay, so then if we go down to the main body of code, we initialize. And then for every row in the table, and the SQL is of no interest here, basically there was some logic about if it's the first time through. So if the current key is not equal to the key ID, then set first time to 1, set the current key, otherwise set first time to 2. If it's the first time, we do the inner loop and we do some extra stuff. And basically that amounts to constructing the file, line in the file, and then writing it out to that file. And then we print out the lines to the file itself. And then there'd be the same thing repeating over and over again for different sets of data. So that's the basic code idea. And also print lines, let's see, add line. Add line is interesting. So add line says, well, hey, it depends on which file you're adding 2 because we have different arrays. So we're basically with a case statement saying if it's this file name, then assign it to this array, otherwise the other array, keep track of the lines, the number of lines that have been put into the array, and so on. So that's the code I started with. Now let's stop sharing. No, we can keep sharing, but I can't see the chat, right, if we're sharing? If I'm sharing, is that right?
You should be able to see the chat.
I wonder where it is. Let's see. I keep moving. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. So what I'm looking for now are some comments on this code. You might have actually done a refactoring. If you've done a whole refactoring of this code, feel free to either DM it to me in Twitter, sfonplsql, or you can send it to me via email at sfeuerstein@insum.ca. But assuming you can now see the code, I'd love to hear any comments about the code before I dive in with my comments. One comment could be, yes, I see the code, because so far I don't see any indication.
Yeah, guys, let us know if, maybe for all we know, we've not been sharing the screen this whole time. I believe we have been. So if you can let us know if you can see Stephen's code.
Okay, so as you think about things and maybe generate some comments, first of all, what caught my mind when I first looked at this code, and I'm hoping the same thing would jump into your heads, is the repetition. Yes. So basically with different numbers, different file and 1 through 7, and in the actual code, it actually had file names or names for variables that were not repetitive. We see the code. Good. Okay. So basically there's this repetitive sequence of declarations. Anytime you see this, you're pretty sure you've got a problem or, let's say, an opportunity to clean things up. And it really becomes a matter of how you do that. Sometimes, and I believe one of my first tips was about this, sometimes what it comes down to is replacing a lot of these parallel declarations with a record structure with multiple fields. And then you don't have to have these multiple patterns of declarations. But what really caught my eye this time was the multiple collections and populating those collections separately. So for example, and also because we're using a nested table, we need to initialize, we need to in fact extend, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's the kind of code I was looking at. I'm thinking, how can I get rid of all this repetition? So now let's see. What I'm going to do is go to my version 2 of 7 files. And now it looks a bit different. So I still got those 7 different file names sitting in different variables. But I no longer have 7 different declarations of files, 7 of count, 7 of lines. All that repetition is gone. How did I do that? Well, what I realized is I could use a string index collection. I love string index collections. So what I've got here is the table of lines, almost like we had originally. Here's my original table of lines. The difference here is that I'm changing it to an associative array. Now, actually, as I think about it, it probably wouldn't matter so much once I finish my refactoring, but the bottom line is don't use a nested table if you don't need to, because with nested tables, then you've got to initialize, you've got to extend, et cetera. And none of that is important to this code. So by switching to an associative array, as you're about to see, it simplifies things. So I've got my set of lines, but then what I'm going to do is make a collection of collections. And it's going to be indexed by a string. Now, I could do a little bit better in terms of my refactoring. I could say I've got a new type, which is called file line and file, tline, and that is a subtype, is varchar2 100, let's say, sorry, 4000. I could get a little bit better in terms of how I'm defining things here and avoid repetition by saying I've got tline. Tlines is a table of tline. And tfiles is indexed by, same thing, let's say. So we don't have to have any of that hard-coded varchar2 except for here. Okay, but now I've got a list of lists, all my file contents. Let's see how that impacts the code. So let's go down to the main body. So I'm just doing that load file 1. We're not showing all the different iterations, but load file 1, right here. I'm going to come back to this part because I've moved away from an integer to a Boolean. But now I create my line. I pass it in just like I did before. This actually hasn't changed. But if I look at my add line procedure, remember, this is what it looked like before. Here's add lines. And all of this code is replaced with this one line. I could get rid of this stuff. I got rid of all the logger stuff for clarity. So let's take a look what I'm doing. I'm taking the line and I'm going to and I've got the file name. I use the file name to find that list in my list of lists. So my list of files. And then I go to the current count, which is 0 for the first line. I add 1 to it. So the first row in this array gets the first line. When I pass in the next line, count is now 1, it goes to 2, but you can see that this single line replaces all this other code because I don't have to do any of this hard coding, none of that hard coding, because I've embedded my list of lines, the file contents, within my upper level array that is indexed by the file name. So I thought this was just such a great example of how you can use string indexing to really concentrate your code and avoid a lot of that repetition. Also, because I'm no longer using a nested table, none of this is necessary. I don't have to do an extend. All of that becomes simpler. So one of the points here is that if you find that somebody's working with nested tables, and they've got all this overhead of needing to initialize and extend, but they're not actually using any of the special features of nested tables, like multisets or set operators or sub-multiset of or a member of. If you don't really need to use a nested table, in this case, it's just making your life more difficult. Now let's take a step. I know we've got a few comments here, so let's see what I've got.
Here, put it up on the screen if that's easier for you, Stephen. So sure. Mark says 3 reasons to refactor in his opinion: faster code, more readable code, shorter code.
So great points, Mark. So, and I probably should have prefaced this a little bit. In terms of refactor, for some people, it's a fancy name that you may not be that familiar with. And it's a fancy name for make your code better, essentially. But refactoring is a fairly specific term that means you're changing the internal implementation of your code in a way that does not affect outside performance or behavior of the code. And that's why when you refactor, it's really important that you have a regression test in place. I'll come back to that in just a second in terms of Sam's contribution. So absolutely. So refactoring is this very methodical going in and changing internal implementations to improve readability, performance, etc. And certainly Mark, I think, is right that reasons to refactor are improving the speed of your code, making your code more readable. That's probably the most common #1 reason to refactor. And if you can make it shorter in the process, great. Of course, making it shorter, concentrating your code, isn't necessarily improving the code, as I think we can attest to if you look at regular expressions or all sorts of weird languages out there that compress things down. And Fernando, great point. I think that, Mark saying that the second reason is more readable code, I think that's probably what Mark meant, more maintainable code. And one of the ways you make code more maintainable is to make it readable and make it shorter if that makes it also more clear. Okay, and let's see, Nils had something to ignore. Don't name it T-line, name it T-file line, right? T-file name.
I think he was taking his comment back.
He did take it back. That's true.
Yes.
Okay, so this is a great example of how using a string index collection, I can both compress code, get rid of that redundancy, but also make it more flexible. Because none of this code, all of this code down here, none of this code relies on specific file names. It's all based on, it's all parameterized by that string value, and then you find the right code inside the list. So for example, when it's time to write the lines to the file, now I have basically the idea is that I can do all my loading. All the loading happens in these separate procedures, and all I'm doing is writing out to one big file or one big array of arrays. And then I have one procedure to write lines to files. Now, it may be that with your approach, you want to write the lines after each file, that you don't do it all in bulk. It may be also that you'd want to concatenate all those lines into a single clob and write a single clob to the file, which could improve performance. But this is the way I did it here. And again, I can just make it entirely generic in the sense that I'm going to start with my file contents. That's the master or the top list, the parent list. So there's an element in this array for each different file name. So that's why the index value, I'm getting the index, the first defined index, is actually the file name. While that name is not null, I've got something to do. And if I've got something in that array, so if the count of that entry is greater than 0, then move lines to the file. And then I move to the next file name. And then inside this program, I'm passing the file name again. So nothing to hard code. Right? I'm going to get the information from the array. I'm going to open the file. This is actually a complexity that I didn't even bother with in the initial code, which is that they also have a maximum number of lines they want to write to a file. For some reason, no more than 200 lines in a file. I kid you not. So we actually have to break up a single file, or let's say thousands of lines, into separate files. But don't worry about any of that. The point being, again,
I think I just clued into what project we're talking about here. I now recognize it. All right.
Right. But again, the point is that all of this is generic. In fact, with a fair amount of the refactoring or code review that I've been doing in my new job, a lot of it comes down to taking code that has a lot of specificity or duplication and specific values in it, or specific named variables, and coming up with a more generic pattern of code that can then be applied more generally. It's been an interesting process. And this is one of those examples. Any other comments?
Not at the moment.
Okay, a quiet group today.
Quiet group, but feel free to put your comments in the chat.
Just seeing Mark wrote, that's why shorter is the third. Yep, good point, Mark. It's definitely, you don't make an objective. I think you don't make an objective of, let's squeeze the code down as densely as we can, though sometimes what I do seems to indicate that. It's really a matter of why you're doing it. In fact, I'll show you my Twitter feed in a moment, or come back to that. And that'll be a good example of precisely this point. Right, so one other thing I just wanted to take a look at, I imagine it's caught some of your attention, was this. So I was kind of surprised to see this. So, it's not uncommon that we say, if it's the first time through the loop, do something special and then don't repeat. With a cursor for loop, or I'm sorry, with a numeric for loop, you can just say if index equals 1 or the first index value. In this case, what we've got is a current key variable that starts out as 0. So it's not set. And I guess the assumption is the key can never be 0. So if it's not equal, we're using this 1 or 2 value. And again, it's not a big deal, but we've got PL/SQL, we've got real Booleans in PL/SQL, let's use them. So if you ever see code like this, I would strongly consider, though it's not any sort of major deal, to change to Booleans. So first time is now true or false, not a 1 or a 0. Again, not a big deal, but you're making better native use of the PL/SQL language itself. Okay, so that I think pretty well covers what I wanted to cover there. We'll see if any other comments come up. So let's now switch over to stop sharing that, and I'll stop sharing that. And I'll now share my screen. Now we're going to get let's see. Okay. And go ahead and share it. And do we now see Twitter?
Don't know what's going on here.
You know what? I think it's from using the same browser. So I'm going to stop that. I'm going to share a different screen. Let's just get it set up the right. Sorry, folks. I obviously should have been a little bit better prepared here. But I was trying something new in terms of how to organize my screens. And it was not the thing to do. So...
Fernando is saying testable code is another good reason for refactoring, isn't it?
Excellent. Yes, that's right. It would make it much more likely that you can test your code effectively if it's refactored into some reasonable facsimile of understandability. Okay, so let's see now. Back over here. Now I'm going to share one window. I'll do this again, this way. Are you seeing Twitter now?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
I feel like whooping with delight.
So 2 days ago, I published a tweet. I was working on some code that had all these, if this is null and this is null and that is null, then do this. And I thought, well, I can change that into a single coalesce. So in case you didn't know, it's relatively uncommon or uncommonly used. Coalesce is a function sort of like NVL, but it's much more general. So with coalesce, it says look through the list, and the first one that is non-null should be returned. So I basically say if this is null, or if this is not null or not null, not null, it will return a not null value. But if all of them are null, it will return null. And I thought this is cleaner, simpler, more elegant than having these streams of is null statements. And it turned out, and so definitely check out my account, SF on PL/SQL. You can go to this tweet. In fact, can I drop it into chat? Of course I can. Let's do that real fast. Can I? Can I put something in chat or just them?
Here, I've just put it up on the screen. Now we've got some craziness happening on what you're sharing.
Go, 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 go. Oh, we're having fun today. Okay, so share my screen again.
Here we go.
Okay.
All right.
So what was interesting is that as I was submitting this, showing the tweet, I thought to myself, I don't know, is that really all that much better? And I assume you've had a similar situation, not so much you're about to tweet something, but more like you're writing some code, you believe this is better or that, and this the other. And as you're doing it, there's this little voice in your head saying, I don't know, Steve, I don't know if I really agree with that. Listen to that voice, as I've said before on some of my tip sessions. Listen to that little voice, because in the end, I agreed with that little voice, and not only with the little voice, but lots of people said, I'm not really convinced it's all that much better. I don't know, I see a problem. Is this more readable? And then somebody else came up with this idea. Why don't you just concatenate them all together? And if that's still null, then it's null. So and some people liked it, no question. Here, this is you're the last true procedural programmer. So, and
Rootvik is asking about a context switch.
Okay, great question. So that came up in one of these points here. So it looks like the question has to do with the fact that you're calling a function and not using native PL/SQL. So first of all, coalesce is a function both in SQL and PL/SQL. And in general, if you ever call something in PL/SQL, even if you're used to seeing it in SQL, if it's called in native PL/SQL, it is a native PL/SQL function. There's no context switch, for sure. On the other hand, if I do a select coalesce, so inside a SQL statement, I call coalesce, even though that might be implemented in PL/SQL, I really doubt it. I doubt any of these are. These are SQL functions. They're not PL/SQL functions, and therefore there's no context switch back to PL/SQL. When you say select substring, select coalesce, all those things, native SQL functions do not worry about context switches. It's only when you're calling PL/SQL functions, things that you've added, your own user-defined functions, or a packaged function like util, dbms util, something or the other. You call that in a SQL statement, you will get a context switch. Okay. Now, so in the end, I backtracked. If you read through the whole thread of comments, I ended up backtracking. I no longer believe this tweet. Wouldn't coalesce be a better, cleaner way to do it? Not really. I think that it's good to know about coalesce. I think that if you had 5 or 6 or 8 of these, this is null, this is null, this is null, until you end up with a really long list, I think maybe then coalesce would be better. And in fact, one of the people who did reply said that exact same thing, that he had something like 8 of them and decided that it worked perfectly for him. And in fact, he made that switch. So I just thought I'd point out that I can be wrong. I can be wrong even about things that I think about my own code. And it's good to listen to conversations and commentary from other folks and learn from what they have to say. And you pick up new things along the way. And one other thing, as a reminder on this topic, let me go back to that so you can see all of it. So you might have an NVL. Or a difference between NVL and coalesce? NVL, so it's NVL of this. If it's null, then return that. NVL will always execute the second argument, the that, even if the first argument is null. So if you have an NVL of some variable, comma, let's call a function that's really expensive, then even if your variable is not null, that function will be invoked. So what you should do, if there's any concern about that, if your second parameter in NVL is a non-trivial expression, you should definitely not use an NVL and instead use coalesce or some other, or a case expression, something like that.
Mark had a comment. Says 99% of the time he'll make a Boolean for the if evaluation, like any or null, then coalesce.
"99% of the time we'll make a Boolean for the if evaluation." Yes, Sure. I think the main advantage to doing that is that you have a little bit more information that you can use some debugging on. So in other words, if that was a really complicated expression and then something's going wrong, it doesn't have the right value. If you put it right inside the if statement or the whatever the conditional statement is, you can't see what it is. So assigning it to a variable first allows you to do a logger call or some trace or output, so you can see what it was. So, but other than that, I wouldn't create a variable just for it. What if the three variables have different data types and are not null? I think conversion requires things to be of the same type, so that could cause a problem. Yep. Good point, Judith. All right. Other comments that I haven't covered yet. So we talked about context switches. Right, so testable code. Okay, so what I'm now going to do is...
I can feel your blood pressure rising as you think about which screen to share.
Oh, I got it. I'm just going to move. Now I know I'm not going to use that same browser. So let's...
All right.
Here, let's share. I think as long as it's not... So now can you see a blog post?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
So Sam, he goes under the name de Pesse, and on Twitter is one of the very active UTPL SQL developers and trainers and presenters on it. And so what he did was take my code and actually kind of fill it out and make it more usable as a test bed, and then built a UTPL SQL test script. I'll make sure that we have a link to this in my blog post. And it's already out on
And
Twitter.
I'll also link to it in the comments of this video.
Great.
So yeah.
But so I think it's great. He didn't refactor my code, so he didn't do his homework assignment. But what he's given is to all of us is a template or a process by which you should go about doing this kind of refactoring. So he basically took his Star Wars Death Star paradigm that he uses for a lot of his demonstrations. So we got a few different tables, and then he went into my code and refactored it to match his tables. And then, so he kind of filled it out. And then he built a test package with UTPL SQL to actually run some tests to verify that it worked. And essentially, what you want to do in this case is verify that the file has the right contents. So what you'll see is that he has a program that reads a file, and then he has some test data in his tables. But more to the point, in his actual test, what he'll do is construct inside his code an array with the text that he expects to see in the file, and then compare that collection with what he's gotten from the file. So this is an example of using this UTPL SQL interface to, at a very high level, say, look, here's what I'm expecting to see. Go out and get the data that I want to compare it to, do the comparison, and I, as the developer, don't have to write all that comparison code. Last week, I think it was last week or the week before, I did an on-the-cheap testing Feuertip. So I said, look, if you're not going to use UTPL SQL, here are some ideas that you can take for any specific program and build your own relatively small, very specific bespoke testing harness. And if I had done that, I would have had to write all the code to do the comparison between these two sets. This is what UTPL SQL is doing for you. And here's the second one, doing the same kind of thing, setting up the actual and expected, and then doing the comparison. So thank you, Sam, for doing this. Again, we'll make sure it's tagged into the blog post. I might actually even recode my blog post to match up with this so you can more easily use what he's done. And hopefully you can make use of it as an example in a demonstration.
And he also photoshopped himself as Darth Vader over your picture, which I think is fantastic.
All right.
A for effort. So, Stephen, you have 15 seconds.
Woo. Okay. What I want to do is, I've got all these. Okay, so to finish things up, let's see. I'm not going to do a favorite book of the month of the week because I forgot to prepare for that, and I could just pull one off. But that's all right. We'll skip that for now.
Let's not wing it.
And we're going to show you 3 different groups, which I might be able to do given we're still showing.
Let me know when you're ready. Okay, ready? Great. Yep. Oh, we had it.
Well, no, because it's not showing. You can
There's
see
the whales. Yes,
okay.
you can.
And save the wolves.
Save the whales, save the wolves. Yeah.
So now it's working. Okay. So, and have you picked the person?
I haven't. Mark, if you can give a think to who. Now we've got the infinite stuff going on your screen. What
so
did
Mark, you
oh, there you
picked
go.
one of these three groups. Thanks for your contributions today. One is Save the Whales. So it's a group that's been around since 1977, doing what they can to save very amazing mammals from going extinct on our planet. Save the wolves. The wolves have been making a comeback in the upper 48 states, but they face severe challenges. And the coral reefs that underlie essentially the entire ocean that are dying out and being bleached. Anything we can do to save them will be fantastic. So Mark, if you could let us know in the comments which you think should get $25 from Insum, that'd be great. Save the whales, save the wolves, save the coral reefs. So thanks to all of you for joining us today. Hopefully that was interesting and useful and helpful. If you have ideas for tips you'd like to see or a tip you'd like to give, let me know. You can DM me on Twitter or get in touch with me in any different ways. And Mark, is Mark still there? Mark is taking a long time to decide. All right.
Save the
coral reefs.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much.
$25 to that organization. Thanks for attending, everybody. Stay safe. Happy coding. And if you're in the upper hemisphere, northern hemisphere, enjoy the wonderful weather and times we have ahead.
Absolutely.
All right, take care. See you next week.
Bye, everyone. Sorry for the technical glitches this week. See you next week. Bye, everyone.